July 23, 1983, Air Canada Flight 143, the Canadian scheduled domestic passenger flight between Montreal and Edmonton that ran out of fuel at an altitude of 41,000 feet. The Boeing 767 glided to an emergency landing at a former Royal Canadian Air Force base, Gimli, Manitoba, that had been turned into a motor racing track. Watch till the end for the mystery behind the incident happened. One day before, July 22, 1983, the Air Canada's Boeing 767 flew from Toronto to Edmonton, where it underwent the routine checks. The next day, it was flown to Montreal following a crew change. It departed Montreal as Flight 143 for the return trip to Edmonton with Captain Robert Bob Pearson and the First Officer Maurice Quentel. The controls captain Pearson was the highly experienced pilot, having accumulated more than 15,000 flight hours. The first officer Quentel was also experienced, having logged over 7,000 hours of total flight time. On July 23, 1983, the Flight 143 was cruising at 41,000 feet over the Red Lake, Ontario. The Boeing 767 was carrying 61 passengers and 8 crew members. The Canada Air Flight 143 was cruising at 41,000 feet over Red Lake, Ontario. The aircraft's cockpit warning sounded, indicating a fuel pressure problem on the aircraft's left side. Assuming a fuel pump had failed, the pilots turned it off, since the gravity should feed fuel to the aircraft's 2 engines. The aircraft's fuel gauges were inoperative because of an electronic fault indicated on the instrument panel and airplane logs. A few moments later, a second fuel pressure alarm sounded for the right engine, prompting the pilots to divert to Winnipeg. Within seconds, the left engine failure, and they began preparing for a single engine landing. As they communicated their intentions to the controllers in Winnipeg and tried to restart the left engine, the cockpit warning system sounded again with "all engines out" sound, a long bong that no one in the cockpit could recall having heard before, and it was not covered in the flight simulator training. Seconds later, the right engine also stopped. The Boeing 767 lost all the power, and most of the instrument panels went blank. The Boeing 767 was one of the first aircraft to include an electronic flight instrument system. This operated on an electricity generated by the aircraft's jet engines, leaving only a few basic battery-powered emergency flight instruments. The engines also supply power for the hydraulic systems. Without it, the aircraft cannot be controlled. To compensate for this kind of power failure, the 767 has what is known as ram air turbine, which is a hydraulic pump driven by a small turbine which is driven by a propeller that rotates because of the forward motion of the aircraft in the manner of the windmill. When the second engine shut down, they immediately searched their emergency checklist for the section on flying the aircraft with both engines out. only to find that no such section existed. Captain Pearson was an experienced glider pilot, so he was familiar with flying techniques almost never used in commercial flight. To have the maximum range and therefore the largest choice of possible landing sites, he needed to fly the 767 at the optimal glide speed. Making his best guess as to the speed for 767, he flew the aircraft at 250 miles per hour. First Officer Morris Quentel began to calculate whether they could reach Winnipeg. He later found out he couldn't land due to the distance to Winnipeg. First Officer Quentel instead proposed landing at the former RCAF station Gimli, which was a closed Air Force base where he had once served as a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot. Unknown to Quentel or the air traffic controller, a part of the facility had been converted to a racetrack complex, now known as Gimli Motorsports Park. Without power, the pilots used a gravity drop which causes the gravity to lower the landing gear and lock it into place. The main gear locked into position, but the nose wheel didn't. As the runway drew near, it became apparent that the aircraft was coming in too high and too fast, raising the danger of running off the runway before it could be stopped. The lack of hydraulic pressure prevented flap extension that would have under normal landing conditions. This reduced the stall speed of the aircraft and increased the lift coefficient of the wings to allow the aircraft to be slowed for a safe landing. Complicating the matters was the fact that with both engines out, the plane made virtually no noise during its approach. People on the ground of the stadium thus had no warning of the impromptu landing and little time to flee. As the gliding plane closed in on the runway, the pilots noticed that there were two boys riding bicycle within 1,000 feet of a projected point of impact. Captain Pearson would later remark that the boys were so close that he could see the look of sheer terror on their faces, and they realized that a commercial airliner was bearing down on them. As soon as the wheels touched down the runway, Pearson braked very hard, blowing out two of the aircraft's tires. The unlocked nose wheel collapsed and was forced back into its well, causing the aircraft's nose to slam into, bounce off, and then scrape along the ground. After the aircraft had touched down, the nose began to scrape along the guardrail in the center of the tarmac. Pearson applied extra right brake, which caused the main landing gear to straddle the guardrail, creating additional drag that further reduced the speed. Air Canada Flight 143 came to a final stop on the ground 17 minutes after running out of fuel. There were no serious injuries among the 61 passengers or the people on the ground. A minor fire in the nose area was extinguished by the racers and course workers armed with fire extinguishers. As the aircraft's nose had collapsed on the ground, its tail was elevated. There were some minor injuries when the passengers exited to aircraft via rear slides, which were not long enough to sufficiently accommodate the increased height. The investigation into the crash of Air Canada Flight 143 was led by Aviation Safety Board of Canada. Their report praised the flight and the cabin crews for the professionalism and skill. The initial fuel load had been incorrectly entered. The fuel had been calculated in pounds instead of kilograms by the ground crew, and the erroneous calculation had been approved by the flight crew. This error meant that less than half the amount of intended fuel had been loaded because of the incorrect fuel weight data had been entered into the system. It was providing incorrect readings. It is noted that the Air Canada neglected to assign clearly and specifically the responsibility for calculating the fuel load in the abnormal situation. And what happened to the airplane, the Gimli glider, after the incident? It's almost 24 years of service. The flight flew its last revenue flight on January 1st, 2008. The Gimli glider flew till January 2008, and it took its final voyage on January 24th, 2008, and got the retirement in the Mojave Desert in California. Please subscribe my channel for more interesting videos, and don't forget to click on the bell icon for the next video.